In a quiet corner of the University of Minnesota campus, 36 healthy American men, volunteers and heroes, though none ever fired a shot, were about to commit themselves to a living hell, a descent into madness and bone-deep hunger. Their sacrifice, the willful starvation of their own bodies, would ultimately save millions of lives across a ravaged post-war world. They were not fighting Hitler. They were fighting famine. Part 1. The Siren Call of War and Science, 1944. The air in the shabby, makeshift basement laboratory of the University of Minnesota's Memorial Stadium in 1944 smelled of sweat, sterile alcohol, and something faintly metallic, the odor of impending deliberate human change. Outside the world was a furnace. The names D-Day, Anzio, and Midway were headlines that defined a generation. America was fully committed to the largest and most destructive conflict in human history. Yet here in Minneapolis, on a campus largely drained of its young male population by the draft, a different kind of war was being waged, and its weapons were scales, calipers, and the precise, measured denial of sustenance. At the center of this unique, almost sacred experiment stood Dr. Ancel Keys, a man whose energy seemed to vibrate in the low-ceilinged room. Keys was not a doctor of medicine in the traditional sense. He was a physiologist, a man obsessed with the mechanics of the human body and its adaptation to extremity. Tall, lean, and possessing the restless mind of a true visionary, he was already famous, or perhaps infamous, as the architect of the military's K-ration, a compact, calorie-dense emergency meal that was keeping soldiers alive from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Pacific. But the war had presented Keys with an even more monstrous, far-reaching challenge than feeding the fighting man. Feeding the defeated, the liberated, the millions of civilians across Europe and Asia facing imminent, widespread starvation. Reports filtering back from Allied intelligence were chilling. Populations reduced to skeletal frames, children with bloated bellies, whole towns surviving on grass and sawdust. The Allies would soon win the war, but they stood to lose the peace if they couldn't figure out how to safely and effectively refeed the literally starving. It was a scientific problem with a massive ethical undertone, and one for which there was no existing data. How much food did a starved man need to recover? Did rapid refeeding kill them? Did high-protein or high-fat diets work better? There was only one way to know: to recreate the famine in miniature in a controlled environment. Keys had his plan: the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. Now, he needed his subjects. They were found not in the military barracks, but in the most unexpected and morally complex corner of American society, the conscientious objectors, COs. In 1944, a CO, a man who refused military service on moral or religious grounds, was a figure of deep controversy. They were often viewed with suspicion, sometimes outright hostility by a fiercely patriotic nation. For many, however, refusing to carry a gun did not mean refusing to serve. These men, mostly drawn from the historic peace churches like the Quakers, Mennonites, and Church of the Brethren, saw the war not as an opportunity for violence, but for radical humanitarian service. They had volunteered for the Civilian Public Service, CPS, performing hard, often menial labor in forestry, agriculture, and mental hospitals. When the call went out for volunteers to participate in a dangerous, long-term experiment that would inflict suffering for a greater good, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands applied. Keys and his team selected 36. They were ordinary Americans, farmers, teachers, engineers, students, united by their commitment to peace and their willingness to endure genuine hardship. They saw this as their battlefield. One of them was Frank W. Brown, a thoughtful, 24-year-old former economics student from California. Frank had refused to kill, but he was willing to suffer. As he stood for his initial physical examination, weighed, measured, and poked under the harsh, bright lights, he looked at the other volunteers. They were robust, full of nervous energy, and for the moment, utterly healthy. "You understand the terms, Mr. Brown?" a stern-looking technician asked, holding up a clipboard. "I do," Frank said, his voice steady. 6 months of near starvation, down to about 1,600 calories a day. "And the symptoms will be severe, Mr. Brown," the technician insisted, leaning in. "Extreme fatigue, irritability, the loss of all interest outside of food. You will suffer mental changes, Mr. Brown. You may become severely depressed. We will not stop the experiment unless your life is in immediate danger." Frank nodded. He knew the cost. His war would be waged against the gnawing emptiness in his own stomach, and the knowledge that his sacrifice would give Dr. Keys the data needed to save the victims of a greater global starvation was all the justification he needed. The 3-month control phase began first. The men, now officially housed together in a specially designated wing of the stadium, were given a high-calorie diet, around 3,200 calories a day. They were encouraged to exercise, read, socialize, and thrive. This was the baseline, the picture of perfect health against which their eventual collapse would be measured. They bonded quickly, sharing stories, dreams, and the heavy weight of their unique moral stand. They were a band of brothers preparing not for battle, but for a fast that would last half a year. The irony was not lost on Frank. In a time of global deprivation, they were gorging themselves on pancakes, roast beef, and ice cream, building up reserves for the day the famine would begin. They were fattening the calves for the slaughter, but the slaughter was of their own health, and the ultimate purpose was salvation. As the weeks of the control phase passed, the 36 men felt invincible, their bodies fit and strong. They enjoyed their lives walking the familiar paths of the Minnesota campus, oblivious to the fact that every pound they gained, every surge of energy they felt, was a cruel down payment on the monumental suffering that Dr. Keys had carefully, mathematically planned for them. The feast, designed to maximize their health before the descent, was nothing more than a final, agonizing farewell to the life they were about to lose. The clock was ticking down to November 17, 1944, the day the food supply would be cut in half, the day the actual war against hunger would begin inside the very walls of their temporary home.
Part 2. The Good Life, Baseline and Belief. The shift from the high-calorie control phase to the agonizing starvation phase was not instantaneous. It was a scientifically managed descent, designed to maximize data and psychological impact. Before the deprivation began, Dr. Ancel Keys needed to establish an immaculately detailed baseline for each of the 36 subjects. The Architecture of Health. The first 3 months, known as the control phase, were a period of meticulously monitored abundance. The volunteers, the famine fighters, were fed an average of 3,200 calories per day, a rich American diet designed to bring every man to peak physical condition. They weren't just eating, they were undergoing constant, rigorous testing. Physical metrics. Every morning they were weighed. Their body fat percentage was measured using specialized equipment. Blood samples, urine samples, and respiratory measurements were taken weekly to monitor metabolic rate and nutrient absorption. Psychological evaluation. These were crucial. The men underwent extensive personality inventories, intelligence tests, and mood assessments. The researchers needed to know precisely what a healthy, well-fed mind looked like before hunger began to erode it. Physical capacity. The men were subjected to grueling treadmill tests to measure their aerobic capacity, or VO2 max, and muscular strength. They were required to walk 22 miles per week, a vigorous baseline activity that would soon become torturous. The goal was to create a flawless scientific template for each man, a nutritional blueprint that could later be used to quantify the precise damage brought by famine. The moral core, the conscientious objectors. To fully understand the severity of the commitment, one must understand the men themselves. The 36 subjects were not just lab specimens, they were individuals bound by an extraordinary moral conviction. Frank W. Brown, 24, the pragmatist. An economics student, Frank viewed the experiment as the most rational, impactful way to use his life during the war. He was methodical, often seen calculating the caloric intake of his meals, even during the high-calorie phase. His motivation was purely utilitarian, greatest good for the greatest number. James A. Plowger, 30, the devotee, a deeply religious man from the Church of the Brethren. For Jim, this was a spiritual fast, a willing submission to suffering akin to the sacrifices described in the Bible. His commitment was unshakable, driven by his faith-based refusal to participate in violence. Lester F. Glick, 22, the idealist, a younger man, saw this experiment as a direct act of human solidarity. He was articulate and popular, a natural leader among the group, determined to prove that nonviolent service could be as crucial as military combat. Their quarters, while sparse, became a community center. They shared stories of their upbringing, debated philosophy, and bonded over their shared commitment to peace. This initial period of physical and psychological well-being was essential. It strengthened the social scaffolding that would later be tested to its breaking point. November 17, 1944. The descent. The day arrived with little fanfare, but immense internal tension. The men gathered for their final normal breakfast. The researchers, led by Keys, were somber. There were no emotional speeches, only the cold, hard introduction of the new regimen. The core of the experiment was the semi-starvation phase, which would last for 6 grueling months. The caloric intake of each man was slashed by nearly half, adjusted to be around 1,570 calories per day on average. The diet of deprivation. The diet was deliberately modeled on the food shortages in wartime Europe, mostly bread, potatoes, root vegetables, and cabbage. It was designed to be sufficient to sustain life, but insufficient to sustain health, replicating the meager rations available to civilians in occupied territories. The cruel calculations. Keys aimed for each man to lose approximately 25% of his initial body weight. The reduction was not random. It was a precise calculation to bring the men into a state of semi-starvation, comparable to the condition of victims in post-war Europe. The first few weeks were deceptively easy for some. The body was living off the reserves built up during the control phase. But soon the reality of the chronic calorie deficit began to bite. The early signs of change. The initial physical changes were subtle but swift. Metabolic slowdown. The men's basal metabolic rate began to drop as their bodies struggled to conserve energy. They felt cold constantly, even in warm rooms. Lethargy and apathy. The vibrant energy from the control phase vanished, and the required 22 miles of weekly walking became a monumental chore, done with grim determination. Food obsession. This was the most dramatic early psychological symptom. discussions, reading, and hobbies were replaced by an intense consuming fixation on food. They spent hours reading cookbooks, collecting recipes, and even dreaming of meals. The world had shrunk, and all that mattered was the next meager portion. As their bodies began to cannibalize muscle and fat for energy, the researchers knew they had successfully crossed the scientific threshold. The men were now living proof of famine, and the data they generated would soon be the most valuable currency in the post-war world. The stage was set for the long, hard mental and physical collapse of the next segment.